So today I'm going to be talking about the copper. It's not organic contaminant, but that's part of the research we are doing, and we're just looking at everything that can be potentially concerning. And today we're going to be talking about copper in the framework of dairy manure. So essentially copper is an essential element. It's not something evil. It exists in nature. Usually you can find it pretty much everywhere in soils and water. The background concentration for copper in soils, let me figure out where's the pointer here, is about 50 microgram per gram. And when we look at the water, like natural waters, non-contaminated, it's about 4 to 10 milligrams per liter. So it's kind of an ambiguous element, but the issue usually arise when we have excessive levels. So normally people uptake about 6 to 13% of copper from water, but that's kind of assuming the natural levels. Those are the data I found at the open source database. If you go to the water quality data, you can find data for different states. Those are specific to Wisconsin, and essentially those are the all available, publicly available data for the last 10 years. Those red lines essentially tell you what is the background levels in water, about 10. And as you can see in Wisconsin, we have some places that have higher concentration of copper, but in the groundwater mostly we kind of within the range of natural levels. For the surface water, we have a little bit different story. We have quite a bit of places that higher than maybe what we consider natural. Keep in mind, those are like composite data from everything, including cities and maybe some industrial points. So just kind of show you where we are as a state. One thing about copper is why it's essential when you hit some kind of a level that higher than it's supposed to be. You can see some essentially negative effects on your health. And it ranges significantly. One thing that, of course there is death, that's like the worst case scenario, but even if you're exposed to the lower levels, elevated levels for a long time, you can develop some of the chronic diseases. That is actually a concern for the sensitive population, like elderly, people with some health issues, and children. So what we are trying to address in our study is to see the impact of dairy production on copper deposition in the environment. So this project was started to kind of address public concern and as well to get some kind of a data to see, is it a problem or not, right? So essentially when we look at the dairy operations, there are several pathways for copper to be entered into the production facilities, and two majors are essentially copper baths that are used for treating cattle, for preventing infections, and that copper bath contains about 2 to 10% copper sulfate, and when it's deposited in the same piles as manure during the operations, it can be deposited in the environment. The second type of copper that you can find in the dairy operations is essentially feed. So this is a reference table. I picked it from that resource, which basically tells you depends what the feed is. You can have a really wide range of concentrations. And if you do the supplements, of course, it's a high concentration, but you use less of the amount of the supplements, right, than you would use the feed. So there is some inputs of the copper in the farms. The problem is copper is not very absorbable by cows, so absorption rate is about 1 to 10%. The rest goes back with manure outside the cow, right? And when you have that manure that potentially have copper, it can be deposited to agricultural fields. It's agronomical disposal of manure that can be then uptaken by the crop, by accumulating the people through the food chain. It can also be leached in the water bodies, surface water, groundwater, or it can stay in the soil and change the soil environment. Specifically, copper is the co-selector for antibiotic resistance. So we were trying to test the system and see where does the copper go, because if you look at the data from the literature, it is known that manure can have an elevated copper concentration, and soil can have some background concentration as well. But when you add the manure to soil, the mass balance doesn't add. So this one is a soil applied with manure, and you see that significant amount is actually unaccounted for. So those are results from 2 farms, and you can see there is a variation, right? So the original manure has quite a different concentration of copper. So we were trying to figure out what's going on and where does the copper goes. That was done on the field, experimental field, where we had a manure that we knew has some copper, right? We measure it, and we apply it to the field at 3 different rates. So those agronomic rates, nothing extreme, something that would be used in the field as a part of the nutrient management. And what we did is we monitor the crops, we monitor the water that was leaching off the soil, and we monitor the soil. So we kind of accounted for the whole system to see where exactly copper goes. One thing that I want to mention is if you go to the farm and you sample manure over the period of a year for, let's say, copper concentration, you will get a wide variation. So those data come from the same farm, just sample over the period of a year, and concentration varies 4 times roughly, right? So it's kind of also, you cannot just assume that it's always the same, some kind of a percentage, and it depends on many factors. And it's also kind of similar to other parameters we measure it. So carbon, solids, and water, they all vary widely. Depends on what's going on. So we pick the highest concentration, we pick the manure from the highest concentration just to kind of simulate the worst case scenario. And what we figure out is the more manure you apply to the field, the more concentration of copper you will find in the soil. So maybe it's not surprising, but we wanted to make sure we have those data to begin with. If you look at the fields that were never applied with manure, those are our fertilizers controls. We do have some concentration. So those are background, levels of copper that exist naturally. When we look at the soil water, and the way we look at it, we have soil lysimeters installed in the field, and we collected the water every 2 weeks through the growth season, and eventually we stopped because crops were harvested, and we measured the copper concentration in those water samples. And as you can see, here's your fertilizer control. We have pretty much the same concentrations. But when we add manure, and that is just example at 1 concentration, you have some kind of a profile that represents the leaching peak. So you start adding manure, you start watering, you have copper coming out, and then eventually it tails out. If maybe we measure longer, we would see them going to the baseline level. So there is definitely copper that's coming from manure, right? So we can see it in the water. The question is, does it affect the crops? So does it bioaccumulate? And from what we found is, and we used 3 different crops, and we measure the eatable part, right? So for potatoes, that would be tuber. For wheat, it would be grain. For barley, it would be grain. And we figure out that even if you apply quite a high concentration of manure, and we know it has copper, right? The bioaccumulation is the same. So the plants, they do bioaccumulate, but it seems like they have some kind of a threshold on how much they can actually uptake. So increasing the amount of copper through application of manure doesn't necessarily increase the amount of copper in the crop, which is a good thing, right? When we look at the soil, and we look at 2 profiles, first 30 centimeters, and then the second layer of 30 centimeters, the concentration of copper were pretty similar. So we did not see any percolation of copper within the soil, which is kind of want to do the disclaimer that was done over 1 growth season. We have data for other growth season. But within 1 growth season, we really don't see anything moving significantly down and being in soil. What I wanted to also point out about this graph is this graph is specifically done for extractable copper. So those are what we deem as plant available, something that is copper 2+, so a soluble version of it. And when we think about that, really, from what we deduce is that really there is a limitation of the system on how much copper can be soluble. So the fact that it can move down, it doesn't mean that it can be available. And that supports our plant data. So essentially we are talking about two different forms of copper. The last experiment we did was actually in the lab. We brought the soil columns in the lab, and we wanted to see, can this copper can actually move all the way down? We did it in the field, and there was a dry year, and maybe it was limited by the water. But when we did it in the lab, and we have plenty of water, it was a steady state flow. We figured out that eventually all that copper is going to get out of the system. So even though in real life maybe it's not that movable within the profile, if you have the right condition, if you have too much water, if you have too much rain, it is possible to mobilize that potential contaminant. Another thing that, sorry for clicking back and forward. Another thing that we also were really surprised is if you look at the fertilizer plots, our negative controls, we have the same pattern of leaching, which means it's not specific to manure, it's specific to just the chemical. And if you have background levels, they will also, bless you, they will also be leached. So to summarize, that's what we were trying to test that system. So basically what we figure out is applying manure to the fields. It's overall a good practice, right? There are some concern about copper being accumulated in the plants, and it is a valid concern, but the plants have some limit on kind of a type of copper they can uptake and how much. But it varies within the different plant. What else we figure out? We figure out that the total concentration will increase, but solubility of copper and its form actually defines where it's going to end up in the system. So you have to account for that. So in the first graph that I show you for the copper concentration in Wisconsin waters, those are total concentrations, right? And it's just kind of important to interpret the data the right way. So you don't get maybe, terrified by data that maybe have some explanation. Another thing is, yes, we show that it potentially can leach to the groundwater. But the thing is, maybe it's still not in the form that is available, and that can cause some kind of environmental issue. So with that, I would like to thank collaborators who helped with this project and funders, as well as USDA IRS services for providing the land to do that experiment. And with that, I'm going to take any questions.
Thank you, Ina. Are there any questions from the audience? We have time for one or two, I think.
I repeat the question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering at what level copper is toxic or could be toxic to microorganisms or even human?
Yeah, so it really depends. I showed the slide in the beginning that it's a wide range of concentration. So it depends what you're talking about. For the human, it can be from really low concentration to high. Depends if you're a child, if you have pre-existing condition. So the range is kind of broadly defined. Usually it's about 1 milligram per kilogram per day, which is really weird thing to think about, right? Like how do you calculate it? But there are other issues associated with copper. I mentioned the antibiotic-resistant co-selection. So that is pretty much any concentration can trigger that. And, but that has to be soluble form. So if it's not soluble, it's not going to trigger. But if it's soluble, any concentration would trigger the antibiotic resistant co-selection. Did I answer your question? I can maybe...
Yeah, here. Thank you so much, Ina, for the presentation. So I'm very curious about the cycling of copper in the soil, especially interaction with the biochemistry, with other elements like nitrogen and the carbon. So my question is come to the, do you think the copper leaching would be like, how that would be very different in the different soil with organic matter? And if so, how that would be, how that would look like if we look into the manure apply into the, different type of soils. Thank you.
I think, well, thank you for the question. It is actually something that we are studying right now in the lab because essentially from our data, the increased organic carbon will mobilize copper. It's mostly going to be bound. It's not going to be available, but it will bring it down deeper to the horizons, which might be a concern. And type of organic matter does matter, sorry, because some of, especially like, for example, manure, right? You already have quite a bit of organic matter in manure. So some of that copper that in the manure is already quite bound to that. But to answer your question, yes, soil type, and organic matter percentage are pretty much two of the main characteristics, and pH for copper basically mobility in soils.
Thank you again, Nina.